Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for another webinar brought to you from Nasdaq Dubai's market site. I would like to thank Alpen Capital for organizing this webinar and using this opportunity to launch their GCC Education Industry Report 2021. I'll be discussing the education sector with our panelists. Joining me are Krishna Danak, who is an Executive Director at Alpen Capital, and Ivo Maketian, Partner at Tamimi and Company. Krishna will be conducting a presentation to launch the report and highlight key findings in the report. Please do share your questions with the host and we'll try to answer them at the end of the session. We have some interesting points to discuss, so without further ado, I would like to pass you on to Krishna for the launch of Alpen Capital's GCC Education Industry Report 2021. Over to you, Krishna.
Thanks, Sahib. A very good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody who's joined us on the call, on the webinar from various parts of the world. Thank you for your time and interest in the Education Industry Report. The presentation is structured to provide yourselves with an overview of the GCC education industry, followed by the impact of COVID on the sector. We will also talk about the outlook, as well as growth drivers, challenges, and trends that underlie this sector. Student enrollments reached about 12.2 million in 2019, up from 11.8 million in 2014. Although the growth was slow, the driving factors were government support, favorable demographics, and the influx of private operators in the region. A rising awareness about the importance of early childhood education also led to the higher enrollments. As you can see from the chart, the pre-primary segment recorded the highest growth in enrollments at a CAGR of about 3.7%. Education has become a focus area for the GCC nations, primarily from the need for evolution from an oil-based economy to a diversified economy, where governments have introduced favorable policies and have encouraged private partnership models to build a knowledge-based economy. Budget allocation towards education also has remained healthy, spending averaged between 12.5% in 2020 versus 14.5% in 2018. Within the countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE allocated about 19% and 15% of their total budgets on education. Although these were lower than their prior year's allocations, they were still higher than countries like US and UK. Most GCC countries reported a modest growth in enrollments. Qatar, for example, had the highest enrollment growth at about 6%. However, Saudi Arabia, which is the largest, remained flat and therefore led to a drop not only in its own share of enrollments, but also led to a muted overall GCC average growth rate. Enrollments in the pre-primary segment grew at a much faster pace than the public segments, which therefore also highlights the importance of and the preference for private education versus public education. GERs in the GCC were mostly at par with developed nations. Primary and secondary GERs were at par with UK and US and also higher than the world average. However, pre-primary and tertiary segment GERs were lower than developed economies, and the regional governments have taken various measures to improve the pre-primary and tertiary GERs with their respective national educational programs and strategies. The sector has also been aided by favorable demographics. Nearly 35% of population was under the age of 24 years of age, and therefore also witnessed an influx of private school operators. As you can see from the table, the growth in the private schools was a CAGR of about 3.5% compared to 0.5% CAGR growth for public schools. This was led primarily by the growing awareness among nationals, coupled with government support towards quality education. And a rising preference for private education and international curriculums also fueled growth in the private segment. Continuous efforts by the governments have improved quality of education substantially over the last 1 decade, with the aim of bringing the ecosystem at par with international counterparts. Increased focus towards technology adoption, enhancing teachers' capabilities, improving school curricula, and the establishing of quality assurance authorities also led to the growth. For example, pupil-teacher ratio improved across segments except for tertiary, and the governments acknowledge this problem and have taken various measures to address the growing challenge of shortage of teachers and staff retention in tertiary segment. COVID, as we know, impacted trade and businesses globally at an unprecedented scale. IMF has estimated a 3.5% contraction in global GDP for 2020. However, within the GCC, the contraction is expected anywhere between 4 to 10% for various countries. The region's fiscal deficit is also expected to widen to about 10% of its GDP in 2020, as a consequence of which the ratings of most GCC economies were downgraded by one notch, with the exception of UAE and Qatar. However, in response, the GCC governments have taken a number of fiscal and economic measures, including substantial stimulus packages ranging from 11% to about 33% of their total GDP. The countries continue to prioritize education sector, as is evident from the stable, if not increasing, share of education budget as a percentage of total budget. Within the sector globally, nearly 1.6 billion students in more than 190 countries were affected by the school closures. For a report by United Nations, more than 94% of the businesses of the schools were impacted by school closures. GCC governments also initiated school closures right at the outset of the pandemic. So much so that the ratio of school days lost was literally much higher in the GCC at about 50% compared to global average of about 30%. In terms of numbers, nearly 2.8 billion students immediately shifted to online learning platforms overnight. The sector also witnessed fee reductions across nations, some voluntary and others by government order. However, on the positive side, the pandemic has accelerated digital learning initiatives in the GCC. Local governments have collaborated with a wide range of international and organizations and a variety of solutions, including online learning platforms, different media forms, television, radio applications were used to not only enhance digital learning, but also to ensure continuity of learning for students. As a consequence, EdTech today has become an integral part of the education system. So COVID obviously has impacted the education sector, not only in the GCC, but globally. It has also upset past interrelationships between performance indicators, both macro and micro, and therefore made it very difficult for us to build projections. We've therefore not presented any size forecasts for an outlook in our industry report, but talked more about focus areas and emerging areas that form the outlook for the sector. So first and foremost being EdTech and digital learning. COVID-19 has highlighted the lack of technology integration into the education system and compelled governments and institutions to optimize operations and swiftly adapt to change and innovate. While the adoption of EdTech is still at an infancy stage, institutes are integrating advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics to improve learning. And therefore, such a strong technology infrastructure will open the sector for growth and investment opportunities going forward. Education sector is also witnessing a momentous shift in structure, leading to blended learning as a preferred education model. This model is basically based on infusion of experiential as well as collaborative learning with a mix of both online and in-person elements. Over the past few years, many stakeholders have also witnessed a decline in returns from traditional education systems. And therefore, such integrated education models are likely to attract higher investments going forward. Education industry, like many other industries, is likely to witness reduced spending from governments on account of the pandemic as well as economic slowdown. And to relieve the budgetary strain and to concentrate on regulatory reforms, governments are expected to further open up the sector for foreign ownership as well as adopt to public-private partnership models going forward. This will not only foster overall quality, but also improve infrastructure and economic stability, not only in the region, but also the education sector as well. An emerging focus area is that the region is emerging as a hub for tertiary education. GCC governments as well as private players are investing heavily to provide quality tertiary education, primarily to retain talent and to make the sector self-sufficient as well. The establishment of branches of renowned universities in the region, along with the appeal and safety to enroll closer to home, is also expected to drive enrollments going forward. And last but not the least, the GCC education sector still remains a fragmented market with several size and type of operators catering to a wide population with varied preferences. Demand-supply imbalances, enforced implementation of technology, and fee reductions have obviously impacted revenues and profitability of most operators. Mergers and acquisitions and consolidations in the sector will therefore not only help create better synergies, but also improve margins and increase management efficiencies going forward. In terms of growth, a post-pandemic recovery is expected to boost the sector going forward. IMF expects the GCC's GDP to improve by 2.3% and 3.5% in the next 2 years. The reopening of the tourism sector, effective immunization, and emphasis towards economic diversification all provide a platform for recovery in the economic activity. And along with that, as physical education resumes, operators will evaluate expansion plans that were otherwise put on hold on account of the pandemic. Another area of growth is the emerging attractiveness of the region, which will spur revenues for growth going forward. Amid the COVID-19 crisis, GCC witnessed dramatic improvements in its geopolitical relationships. These are likely to improve trade prospects and highlight the potential to generate billions of dollars in revenues through inter-regional deals. Also, upcoming mega events such as Dubai Expo, FIFA World Cup, along with long-term or permanent visas and relaxation in FDI guidelines, will boost the region's attractiveness, as well as encourage expatriates to not only live and work but also study in the region, which will then automatically lift the education sector going forward. Government's initiatives to boost education landscape will spur growth. Each of these governments have national transformation initiatives. All of them are aimed to improve enrollment levels and literacy rates. And privatization initiatives by the governments are also likely to boost the education sector going forward. High per capita incomes in the region are obviously driving demand for quality education. GDP per capita in GCC averaged almost $33,000, which is 3 times higher than the global average of about $11,000. The region also benefits from favorable demographics with a growing youth population. School-age population is expected to grow at a CAGR of about 1.3% going forward. And with that growth, we expect demand for K-12 and tertiary education to also improve. And lastly, influx of international schools, which have led to expansion of curriculums in the region, will continue to further push the sector. These are thought to enhance students' skill sets as well as prepare them for higher education going forward. In fact, UAE in the region has the highest number of international schools at about 77, and therefore ranks second in the world for having the highest number of international schools. In terms of challenges, the first and foremost challenge that underlie the region is the economic slowdown, which is scaling back growth. The slump has likely to result in about $270 billion in revenue losses for the GCC amid sharp correction in oil prices and also the pandemic. Regional governments have come under increased pressure in terms of aiding spending across all sectors, including education. Competition is also increasing cost pressures and eroding profit margins of operators. Increase in supply has obviously intensified competition, but the pandemic has only increased this further. A combination of salary cuts, job losses, reduction in fees, enhancing digital learning platforms, and blending learning structures have all resulted in lower revenues and profitability for the public and private sector included. The sector also faces a shortage of skilled teachers and education staff. Hiring and retaining high-quality educational staff to match the requirements has been a challenge. Added to that has been nationalization drives, which are restricting the number of expat teachers. And with new schools launching, this challenge is expected to continue going forward. The sector also faces the challenge of students having a preference for tertiary education in overseas destinations. Outbound mobility is driven by students preferring education in international locations, and also it is perceived to enhance employment prospects. Moreover, the rising cost of education has also led a lot of expats to return back to their home countries to pursue higher education. In terms of trends, as I've been saying in my entire presentation, EdTech has become an indispensable part of education system today. Digital transformation in education sector was not only a focus in the past, but the pandemic has now accelerated this process. And as I mentioned, specific platforms, mediums have been used extensively to ensure continuity of learning for students. There's also increasing options for higher education to provide quality offerings in the sector. Increasing demand for quality higher education institutes has led to the development of dedicated educational zones. The UAE is a prime example of this. And therefore, inbound student mobility has also improved over the last few years. In fact, for UAE, the inbound mobility ratio is about 48%, which is much higher than global destinations such as US, UK, and Australia, which are all global education destinations. Another trend emerging is the transformational rise of STEM education. changing job landscape has obviously made the requirement for specialized skill sets for students, which has led to an uptick in demand for higher education, specialized fields such as science, technology, engineering, mathematics, commonly referred to as STEM. In fact, data from the US Bureau of Statistics showed that STEM occupations are expected to grow at 8% by 2029, which is 3 times higher than the growth of all occupations put together at about 3.7. And last but not the least, demand for affordable schooling has been on the rise. A supply imbalance has emerged with a growing number of schools offering premium education compared to those offering quality education but at affordable prices. And the need for affordable schooling has only been exemplified at the wake of COVID-19, where educational institutions have had to offer fee discounts to ease the burden on families that have been struggling on account of job losses and pay cuts. So in summary, student enrollments have increased, although at a slower pace, primarily on account of government support as well as rising awareness. Government strategies aimed at building a knowledge-based economy will enhance the industry landscape going forward. Growth will primarily be driven by young population, economic recovery, as well as adaptation to technology. The pandemic has led the sector into a phase of digital and technological transformation, which is expected to witness increased collaborative measures and investments in digitization, primarily aimed to create better synergies and improve operational efficiencies. Added to that, the recent developments in geopolitical relations and economic policies, coupled with the upcoming mega events, lend themselves to the region's attractiveness for providing avenues for growth. Industry has also witnessed healthy M&A in the last few years, which is expected to continue. So we believe that a post-pandemic economic recovery, coupled with the government's initiatives and policy changes, will present very interesting opportunities for investors in the sector going forward. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Krishna, for the presentation, and congratulations on once again another fantastic report. It looks like the education sector in the GCC is becoming stronger year by year. This is Alpen Capital's 6th report on the GCC education sector. Expanding on the data you presented to us in the presentation, how have you seen the sector evolve over the years?
If you look at the last decade, and from our report dating about 10 years ago, where we were talking about privatization, we were talking about governments putting up specialized educational zones, putting up regulatory bodies. We've witnessed all of that. We've got now regulatory bodies that look after the sector across all the nations. We've got performance standards that are now aligned with international standards. The growth of the private schools is an example of how preferences are changing towards international curriculum and private schools as well. So we've seen quite a bit of change in the last few years, and we expect that to continue going forward. The recent M&A activities that have happened over the last 2 years, and in fact in the first quarter itself, I think are demonstrative of the interest that the international community has in the sector in the region.
And we're seeing more and more school brands from outside of the region coming and setting up here, and the existing school operators have been expanding over the recent years. The fact that Tamimi has a practice that focuses specifically on the education sector tells us about the level of interest and investment in the sector. Are there any particular areas that have been a focus of interest for you at Tamimi?
Thank you, Tara. And just to say kudos to Alpen Capital on this report. It's an absolute treasure trove of data. So if anybody's interested in the sector, they should certainly get their hands on this report pronto. But come to your question, yes, we have an education sector group which deals with all segments within the sector, from preschool, school, higher education, training institutions, both from an investor point of view, property owner point of view, and educational provider point of view. I would say the key trends that we've seen over the last 12 months are, number one, huge interest in the Saudi Arabia market. It has been opened up to foreign direct investment for a few years now. There's a lot of school operators that want to move in there. As the report shows, the demographics and the data there are just irresistible from a point of view of the need for private sector contribution there. It has gone into a bit of a holding pattern as a result of COVID, but we do expect that to be reignited. And also, and the report brings it out nicely, the preschool opportunities in Saudi Arabia are absolutely vast. When you look at an economy with greater female participation in the workplace, there's going to be a lot more opportunities for for preschool. But you can't talk about education without talking about edtech. It's a buzzword at the moment, and that's definitely one of the huge trends that we've seen over the last 12 months. I would say, in our experience, Dubai was probably one of the most edtech capable markets in the world. Really, I mean, it transitioned quite smoothly across to that new learning. The other trends I just mentioned two more. One is PPP, public-private partnerships. That is looking to be the preferred model for the delivery of education in the region. I mean, in UAE we have Dubai Schools that was just announced the other day. Abu Dhabi we have the charter schools. Saudi Arabia have a build, maintain, transfer PPP project. Qatar, Bahrain, all of them have. But I think what's going to be interesting, in particularly in Saudi, perhaps, is when it moves into PPP, where the school operator comes in and runs the school, like Dubai Schools. That's a fascinating potential development. And finally, the final observation we'll have on that is in relation to special needs. There's, whoever you talk to in education across the region, it's a topic close to the surface on everyone's lips. And it's something that, there's a need to build out more capacity. Currently, the funding model isn't quite there for an expat population. It would require, wouldn't stand on its own 2 feet on a pure private scenario. It would require some level of government contribution. So that's something that I know the governments are looking at, and it's also quite exciting.
So a lot of time when we speak about education, the focus I find tends to be on primary and secondary education. And you just mentioned that preschooling there's a huge opportunity when it comes to preschooling. But in the last few years, the higher education sector has seen a rapid development. Do you see scope for further growth in higher education?
I would answer that question by maybe differentiating within the GCC. I mean, the UAE, we have I think over 100 higher education institutions of one nature or another. So per capita, that's quite a heavily congested space, I would argue. I think there are opportunities for strategic courses or institutions to come here, and by that I mean people have often talked about, for example, a dedicated nursing degree in the UAE, a dedicated teaching college, and maybe other things that are considered important from a political risk point of view, particularly after COVID. People realize about supply chains and relying on distant either staff or products. So I could see the region moving towards maybe considering training their own population in some of these things that are strategic. Beyond that, I think Saudi Arabia has also opened up to its higher education sector. I wouldn't say we're seeing a stampede of people going there just yet. I would imagine that foreign universities might dip their toe in the market there by initially having an academic collaboration agreement with a Saudi university, and perhaps then over time maybe going into a bricks and mortar type of establishment. One of the other things about higher education, I mean, if you talk to people in higher education in the UAE, I mean, they're I wouldn't say they're buoyant, but COVID hasn't been the nightmare for higher education that has been, for example, for nurseries, where a big bloodbath. But if you talk to people in higher education, they've had a good, very strong enrollment figures that's come through in the data. And obviously people are saying, well, look, that's COVID related. But also I think if you look at the strong UK, US universities who would typically look globally, if you talk to them, they're thinking even post-pandemic, this is something that they need to do to safeguard their own interests and build an international branch campus to, dare I say, be a hedge against a future pandemic, or just generally as something that they want to have an outpost and build up a capacity. And in fact, I was talking to some people recently in the UK about this, and they said the sustainability agenda, which is on everyone's lips, is actually driving thought process within universities about building a campus in that region rather than having a carbon footprint where we're flying everyone to the UK or US. So it's an interesting angle, but I do think that they are, maybe you could say post-Brexit as well, particularly UK institutions are looking at planting flags in other jurisdictions.
Yeah. I want to stick with the topic of the pandemic. Krishna, this is the first time in your education reports where you've had to include a section on a specific global pandemic, in this case, COVID-19. The pandemic has affected almost all aspects of the GCC economies. How has the education sector fared? We see in the report approximately 1.6 billion students around the world were affected, and many of them still are. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, of course, I think the education sector has been very heavily impacted. We've seen school closures. In fact, whilst the governments took appropriate steps in terms of school closures right at the outset of the pandemic, that has also resulted in the school closure days here being the highest in the world as well, at about 50%, whereas the global average is about 30%. And then with that, obviously there's been outbound mobility of people who had job losses, salary cuts, fee reductions. So operators have definitely felt the heat of COVID-19. Added to that, as we've seen, budgetary allocations have also been slightly lower than the previous years. But I think that's basically covered by now government's focus on trying to get to, like you mentioned, PPP models. We've seen UAE come up with those models very, very heavily. We are also seeing those kind of models in the national agendas that now each of these countries have towards putting up a more sustainable economy and not having an oil or tourism or services-driven economy reliant.
And you mentioned about edtech and how edtech is becoming more and more popular. But you mentioned brick and mortar, and I think it's an important link. So look, do either of you think that the pandemic has had an impact on the brick and mortar model of learning, and distance learning is going to take over?
In a word, no.
Okay.
I think, look, edtech's here to stay, and it's fantastic, but I don't see it replacing bricks and mortar. I think parents and students would agree as well that they want to go to a school, they want to meet their friends, they want to build relationships. School is a very important pastoral role to play as well. But obviously edtech's here to stay from the point of view of, assessment, individualized assessment programs, and the power that it can bring to the equation. So I think it's going to be a blended approach, but I think kids will be going to school, maybe not having a school bag, but maybe a tablet, but I think they'll be going to school.
I think parents are the ones who will want to make sure that kids go to school, because I get a lot of feedback from parents who are saying it's not easy having kids learning from home.
I was just going to second that to what you said. If anything, COVID-19 has highlighted that brick and mortar is necessary. Look at any parent and ask them if they would want their kids to go to school, and everybody's going to put their two hands up and say yes, of course. Obviously, students need that environment, that atmosphere to develop. I believe, and personally, I believe, every child is a flower to blossom, and they need the right environment. And that can't be given indoors. So, like what said, yes, blended learning models will evolve. But I think brick and mortar, social, psychological development, physical development of students can't be done indoors.
Definitely interpersonal skills. Definitely you need to be interacting physically with other students to build interpersonal skills.
Until the world actually goes into a phase where everybody's, where no two people have to actually ever know each other or meet each other and can work behind a camera. Till then, I don't think education and brick and mortar is going anywhere.
So the region is bringing in regulations for long-term visas and residences, as well as 100% ownership from many sectors, including education. With a region-wide presence, what is Tamimi observing with respect to the developments of such regulations, and more importantly, their implementation?
Sure. Well, the UAE announced in November that it was going to allow foreign direct investment at 100% level in certain sectors, and education was on what we call the positive list of sectors where that was allowed. We're waiting on at the Emirate level, the DED, the Department of Economic Development, to issue the procedures for that, but it's going to happen. Saudi Arabia in 2017 actually went 100% FDI in education. The Bahrain allows 100%. Qatar's the traditional 51-49%. So look, there's no barriers there from the point of view of getting capital into the operating co. I would say. I mean, the property side is a different play, and there are restrictions in certain areas in relation to foreign ownership of property. But from the actual education company point of view, you could say the handbrake's off, and things are wide open, and it's just a matter of now people coming in and taking advantage of
And Christian, an interesting growth driver you highlighted was about the macro level developments that happened during 2020. How do you see these recent developments impacting the region?
I see the next decade is for the region. I think they've come at a very apt time. I mean, where the entire world was juggling with COVID-19. I think what the region has managed to do is really improve its trade relationships and geopolitical relationships, and I think that gives a tremendous amount of impetus of what was otherwise not happening in the last 3-4 years, or maybe even more, with improvement in relations with Israel, for example, the upliftment of the embargo with Qatar, and that provides a lot of potential for inter-regional deals. I think people have got internationally. I think people will take a lot more comfort in the region, putting in money, putting in time and effort. We've seen M&A activity continue irrespective, and I think that, and with these macroeconomic developments since last year, we are seeing a lot more interest from international players in the education segment itself. Per se, we're running a couple of deals where we've seen more interest from the international players than local players to come and establish their base. I mean, a lot of points that Igor mentioned in the past would probably be driving factors for that, but the macro developments definitely lend to the region's attractiveness going forward. Mega events, for example, which are scheduled, and I think which will attract a lot of people to come in, live, stay, and study here as well. So I think overall, I think in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll see a very different side of the region as well. We've seen, and this has been the undercurrent of this region, right? Promises are not just made but lived up to as well. And we've got another announcement where, for example, in Dubai, they want to create a city to live, place to retire, place to study. So all of these visions will be met in the future, and that will really transform the region going forward.
And we've seen the challenges that the education sector faces, such as a shortage of highly skilled staff and high operating costs. But Ivor, what have been major challenges that investors in the sector face?
Yeah, look, I think Chris has covered at the macro level what a lot of those challenges are. Obviously, fees being reduced through competition and fee freezes, tuition fee freezes. Obviously, it affects the top line, so that's a challenge. I think we discussed the UAE and potentially saturated market. How do you find your niche in that market? So that's obviously a challenge. One of the main challenges is a sort of a relationship, I would say, challenge, which is oftentimes we have one party introduced to the other, either investor and operator, and the crunch of whether they're aligned, whether they have the same ethos, unfortunately, can take some time to get to, and it's a lot of time expended on it. And it's one of those things where you need to be clear on what your expectations are and what your alignment is, and whether you can work together. It's something I think it'd be good to get to sooner rather than later in the conversation. Obviously, there's issues in relation to property, the price of the annual lease, whether the play is a propco play really, which isn't going to help the opco. They have divergent interests, or whether it's again goes back to the alignment, whether they're actually aligned, whereby the opco can flourish and it's not going to be saddled with too many obligations. So yeah, they're the sort of the main challenges. And one thing just to add, just to go back to the point about the higher education and the opportunities there. One thing I should have mentioned was we believe there's a huge opportunity for vocational and technology training colleges, TVET. Doesn't really exist here. In Saudi they have some, but generally, that's not really fully fledged to the extent that it probably should be. And you look around at some of the industrial heavyweights that we have here, Mubadala, ADQ, ICD, absolute behemoths, and it would be good to be in a position whereby we could do that type of training and add value here in the UAE.
In fact, with your permission, may I ask you something? Please. So, with the impetus on Nasdaq, Dubai's growth market, and just capital markets in general, what kind of activity are you seeing vis-a-vis investors and operators here, specifically with respect to the education sector? Are you seeing them coming up, looking for opportunities at their brick and mortar schools? What kind of activity have you witnessed in the last couple of years?
So look, it's interesting. I guess from the exchanges perspective here in Dubai, both Nasdaq Dubai and DFM, what we've been working on is a more efficient access to capital markets. So the growth market that you mentioned is geared towards more SMEs and younger businesses, opening up free zones to list on DFM. We want to open the capital markets up and make it easier for various, not just education, but various sectors to consider doing an IPO and raising funds from the capital market. Now, the discussions over the last 12 months I've been having with investors and market participants is very much based around three sectors. You've got tech, obviously is the most popular one today. You have healthcare, and you have education. So that's where the focus is. And obviously tech is built into healthcare and education. When it comes to education specifically, yes, we've been speaking to operators now who are interested, and I guess the benefit we have, especially here in UAE, is the fact that, and this is something I saw in the report. If we look at the GCC, every country has, the number of schools have been growing, but both from private and a public perspective. Here, the UAE was the only country where actually the number of public schools went down and the only private schools went up. So obviously from a capital markets perspective, we're looking at the private schools, and we have been having discussions with some of these operators that are now looking to raise capital through a potential IPO. And what is the purpose of them to raise capital? It's purely to expand, to buy new properties and to build new schools. So that's what we're seeing in some of the discussions we're having. So that's one side of it, how we can look at it. Then the interesting part is I've had a discussion with a number of entities that are either involved in property funds or REITs, or looking at setting up REITs. And one of the areas that the REIT would focus on is education. And that's another way we will see that the capital markets will be able to help the education sector. Hopefully we'll see some of these education operators IPO soon. We are having discussions, but it's definitely a sector which investors are interested in. And then, look, I'll ask you sort of one final question before we take some questions from the audience. The report covered many trends that we are seeing in the sector. Technology, of course, is very important right now, but I think affordable schooling is something on a lot of people's mind. Is there any particular trend that stands out for the two of you, and what is your future outlook for the sector?
So I think for me, the fact that the region is emerging as a hub for tertiary education stands out. I think the impetus from the government on making it self-reliant, having people not only come here and study here, but also possibly provide them with guaranteed placements, etc., will obviously boost enrollments in the region going forward. UAE has already become an educational hub in the region, and I think a lot of nations are taking cues from there. There is the right base, a platform. You've got very favorable demographics. So that for me, I think stands out. And in the next few years, I think I'll see that segment of education really grow.
Yeah, for me, I think PPP was the standout in that it's becoming the preferred model to deliver from the government point of view. So, we could be in a situation where we're seeing Ministry of Education, public schools being run by private companies, which is something that would be unimaginable a number of years ago. So that's of interest, and I totally echo what you said to the affordability. And obviously the report shows that some of the premium schools and the newer schools have capacity. And the enrollment figures of the Dubai schools was just off the Richter scale. So it as an affordable option. So there's definitely plenty of space for those options.
Good. So look, I'm going to move on to some of the questions we've received from the audience. The first question I see here, I'll start with is, how do you see demand and supply mechanics in the near term?
I think for the next couple of years, and I was talking to somebody yesterday, next couple of years, definitely, the capacities will need to get filled up. Like I mentioned, some of these mega events, the improvement in geopolitical relationships will lend themselves to the region's attractiveness. And over the years, once, there is a post-pandemic sort of economic recovery that's setting in phase, like I said, operators will start evaluating plans that are put on hold. And as you mentioned, they're also looking at raising capital. There are financial investors, there are strategic investors who are all looking at this segment. There are international investors. So yes, the next couple of years, I think the focus is going to be on really building capacity or building capacities that has been impacted by the COVID, integrating, I think, technology for the next 12 to 18 months. And then the growth phase in terms of expansion and investments will definitely be witnessed.
Are there anything you'd want to add?
No, I think Chris just covered. I'm not going to argue with him. He's got all the data points, so I'm just going to.
Look, I personally think, obviously, especially here in the UAE, a big factor is expats, right? And it's making such a large portion of the population. For education to grow, the population needs to grow, and that's where, especially what I've been hearing in discussion I've been having, the pandemic has actually made people think about coming more to Dubai. I've heard a lot of people who have said we're thinking of relocating our businesses from places like Europe to Dubai. And why? Is because the way the government handled the pandemic. We were in lockdown for what, 3 to 4 weeks only. And if you look at Dubai and UAE today, everything is practically open. There are very limited restrictions or businesses that are closed. And from that perspective, I expect that there will be people who think about moving their businesses and will move their businesses here, which will increase the population and in turn hopefully have an effect on the education sector. I've got another question here. Is the market shifting from lower segment of the market? Has this come at cost of education quality, i.e. lower cost teaching staff with different set of abilities? And maybe if I just try to sort of rephrase that, obviously there's a gap between the top end education facilities compared to the lower cost education facilities. Will that shift? Will we still see that gap, or do you think by the control of the government of the fees, we'll see that gap narrow?
So I think definitely, that gap has to narrow. That's going to be a natural phenomenon. And as I mentioned in the presentation and the report as well, affordable schooling is on the rise. Some of the very large premium schools have had to offer fee discounts, which have obviously hit their revenues and profitability. So I think there is going to be a plane where, of course, we will have schools across all segments. There will be to cater to the vast majority of the population, which are ranging from low end to the sort of ultra high end. But I think over a period of time, with this blended sort of concept coming in, people will look at options more on quality than I think really the pricing. So quality is where I think the focus of all schools are going to be more than the pricing. I personally look at quality of education, and if that comes at an affordable price, then might as well.
And I would just to run on the point I made around the government restricting the hikes in fees. Do you think we'll see a lot of that happening over the coming years in the different GCC countries?
Well, look, if I can take up the point, just to finish the point that Christian made, I think there are operators here pre-pandemic who used EdTech to deliver, they packed a punch that was much bigger than you would think on the tuition fee. Very strong academics, and they were using EdTech before it was, the buzzword that it is now. So I think there was always that in the market whereby you could get an affordable option and very strong academics. Now, they mightn't have all the facilities that you would have in a premium school, for example, as in adult facilities, but they were very strong in academics. So those type of operators are sitting pretty now, I think, and they have a very good space in the market. But going to your point, Ira, about regulation, look, I think the government here are sensible. They'll do it to the extent that it needs to be done. Let's put it that way. I don't think they want to be over-regulating the sector. At the end of the day, expats across the GCC rely on these private institutions. The government is appreciative of that and wants them to come here and set up and have long growth here. So they're aligned in that sense, but I think they also have to, obviously, in the current time, it is a pandemic, they have to keep an eye on the costs for the residents. But I don't see it being something where we're going to have a huge amount of regulation or involvement by the government going forward.
And I guess it's just like many other sectors where it's supply and demand. So prices are dependent on supply and demand as well. And we've spoken about the pandemic on number of occasions on this panel, but we've got a question here around how do you assess the education landscape in the UAE during that crisis? So I think specifically looking at UAE within the region. Is there anything you want to add on what you've already said?
I think we've covered that in the presentation. Obviously, the sector had its own challenges. A lot of immediate shifts onto digital learning platforms, but I think we covered it.
Just to briefly touch on it, I think the UAE does require, does deserve recognition that the schools here, the job that they did, because they did transit quite smoothly onto the EdTech platform. And one of the things you hear from students pre-pandemic going to higher education, be it here or anywhere else, from schools in the UAE, they're often disappointed at the level of tech, chalk and talk, blackboards. They were like, what's this? I've gone back to Charles Dickens' times. And that was a refrain you'd often hear. Classic, probably only the UAE, because it was at the forefront of EdTech, is at the forefront. So, I think it requires, I think it deserves huge kudos for the job it did. So that's my 2 cents.
Good, thank you. You mentioned M&A, and in an even sort of first quarter, we saw M&A transactions. We've got someone asking any views on aggregation players, M&A, and consolidation in the sector from your guest. Do you think we'll see more M&As? I've mentioned there are companies thinking of going to capital markets through an IPO. Do you see that we'll have more M&A within the region, and maybe cross-border?
Definitely. I mean, if you look at the activity in M&A in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of cross-border activity any which way. In fact, in the first quarter itself, we've seen a cross-border activity. We've got an international school acquire a local school in Dubai. So that will definitely continue. Also, one thing to look at is corporates here or larger organizations are also looking at their own portfolios and figuring out what businesses are core to them and what businesses are non-core. And we are seeing corporates some of them looking at education as core, some non-core, which automatically lends itself to some kind of M&A in the activity. And as I mentioned, demographics are favorable. So otherwise, out of M&A, even newer opportunities, greenfield opportunities are also likely to step up.
Yeah, I totally agree. Look, I think if you look at any sector, as it matures, there's more in M&A. Just as it's like gravity, it's back to life. And as the sector here grows and gets older, just even that alone is going to drive M&A activity. That's just the nature of industry. But obviously the pandemic has accelerated that, because if you have a multi-site operation, you got more leverage and it's easier to buy these expensive platforms and to hedge your bet, so to speak. And we're definitely seeing a lot of interest externally, as you said. And one of the things you hear is that the valuations are more realistic now. That's one. If you talk to these, of course they're going to say that these guys are required. But one of the things that we complained about beforehand was that it was unrealistic. So one of the things you're hearing now, it is a bit more realistic. We can do deals, and we're interested in doing deals in the Middle East.
And not only just that, you mentioned about structure. So you not only got financial investors looking at the entire segment of the operations, but also looking at dividing it into an OpCo and PropCo model. So you've got funds chasing the real estate part of core sectors like healthcare and education, primarily because they believe these are long-term sectors. So that also is going to drive, let's say, capital, so equity market activity into this sector.
And then I believe that it's also a diversification. When you look at the capital markets today, what options do investors have to invest in education? Very limited. And I think that demand aspect is really going to help companies that decide to go public to get the right valuations that they're looking for. And we've got a number of questions around, what we expect in the future here in the UAE and challenges, which I think we've covered quite a number of points on there. There's one question here, sticking to sort of investors, is do you think returns to financial investors in education in the coming decade will be higher, the same, or lower than in the past decade?
Put me on the spot. I think, but they will be appropriate to the level of risk they take, right? It's a very, very cheeky answer, but that's how it's going to be. I think investors who expect tremendous amount of returns, obviously to look at their fair in terms of expecting the returns. Like Ivor mentioned, valuations have come to a fair point, and similarly, I think return expectations also need to be narrowed down. That's where we'll have a win-win situation. Returns will definitely be there appropriate to the kind of risk, and I think education as a segment is long term, so returns to investors are definitely there, and that's why we are seeing people raising capital to invest in either operations or the real estate, both related to either education or healthcare.
So we have another question here around looking at UAE specifically compared to other GCC countries. How would you rate the UAE compared to other GCC countries education-wise?
So I think definitely it's an example in terms of how it has drafted its own policies. It's got regulations. It's got regulatory bodies that are looking at the sector. The number of the growth in the number of private schools in the region is evidence enough in terms of what kind of comfort people have, investors have, as well as parents and teachers have in that segment here. Educational zones are being established. So definitely, and as I mentioned, UAE ranks second in the world for the number of international schools here, and it's also becoming a hub for tertiary education. I think that's a key to take for everybody. They've done very well, and I think it'll continue going forward, given that they've already set a platform for themselves now.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think in the UAE, we take it for granted that, of course, your child can't choose between UK curriculum, US, IB, Australian, Indian. That's a given menu. I mean, that's unheard of in most other jurisdictions. So it's an incredible petri dish, and I think it's a great example. And I think other countries are following it and opening it up. I also think that schools and operators that have done well in the UAE will do well in neighbouring countries. I mean, I'm stating the obvious here, but I do believe some school groups, I think, maybe come in here to dip their toe in the Middle East, and then it's a fantastic platform, I think, to build out then into perhaps Saudi or Egypt or wherever you want to go, because I think you get it, you understand how it works and the nature of the market. So yeah, I think it's fascinating.
And look, that brings me nicely onto the next question, which talks about curriculum. And where is curriculum development heading, especially in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think that, yeah. Well, look, Saudi Arabia, if you look at the number of students in Saudi Arabia that do their higher education abroad, the vast majority go to the United States. I think it's 80,000 a year. And then the next one is the UK. Then after that, there's various others. But so from looking at that point of view, you would have to say a US curriculum school in Saudi or a UK curriculum school in Saudi will be well suited if the parents want to send their children to those places. But if you talk to the Saudi authorities, they're not. I mean, they're agnostic about this. They're not saying you have to have one or the other. But that to me would be the direction of traffic.
And then from the report, what insights would you provide to service providers in the education sector? So as a service provider, what would you, from the research you've done, what sort of pointers would you like to put forward to service providers themselves?
You have the question. What kind of service provider?
I guess the school operators. is probably.
I think school operators obviously have,
They know what they do.
Yeah,
So that's for sure.
they've had the toughest time in the last 1 year, and I think they've all geared themselves up very well in terms of providing not only edtech platforms, but just blending this whole concept of providing a mix of in-person as well as online learning tools. So I think they probably know their job better, and they would have, I'm sure, geared themselves up for the next couple of years.
Good. And I'm gonna take the last question now because we are coming to the end of the time. Do you see more supply coming in the premium space? Are we going to see more and more top-end schools coming and establishing here in UAE and the wider GCC?
Definitely. I think, oh, sorry.
Okay.
Definitely. Like I mentioned, the GCC has the highest per capita incomes in the world. So the pace of which is probably going to be slow, but definitely, the market is right, the dynamics are right, the demographics are there, and operators across the globe will have opportunities like these to establish their schools. So definitely there will be higher schools coming in the future.
Yeah, just maybe dealing with Saudi, I think it might be a little bit more nuanced. I mean, I think there will, of course, I mean, it's a huge population. Of course, there's going to be room for premium schools, but culturally, they're not used to paying for education. So it's a bit of a quantum shift. And of course, there's very little, there's much lesser expat market in Saudi. Most of them are local. So I think perhaps less space for the ultra premium. There will be space just because of the size of the market and that critical mass. But I think sweet spot's probably going to be medium to high rather than premium.
Excellent. Well, look, Krishna, I will thank you for participation today. A very insightful look into the education sector. A special thank you to the team at Alpen Capital for not only organizing today's webinar, but also providing us with a very detailed report on the GCC education industry. Congratulations on the report launch. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. You can download the report from Alpen Capital website at www.alpencapital.com. And please feel free to contact Krishna and the team to discuss the findings in the report in more detail. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.